15th of January, 1944. Cold rain over Yokohama. Hiroshi Takeda stands under idle cranes and counts hulls that do not come in. He is a mid-level industrial planner who tracks steel, fuel, and shipping flows for the war factories. He notes fewer tankers at anchor and matches the empty water to falling output in his ledgers. If this trend holds, he thinks, fuel and shipping, not bombs, will stop Japan's engines. His goal is to keep production alive by shifting priorities before the break point, so he decides to warn Tokyo in secret memos that the blockade is the decisive front. After the embargo of 29th of July, 1941 shuts off legal oil, he is told to trace the new lifelines. His task is narrow. Follow crude from seized wells to home refineries by what comes across his desk. He does not see the fields. He sees berth schedules pinned to a board, cargo manifests someone lets him copy, and short remarks from port officers about tankers that have not tied up when they were due. He builds a ledger that he can keep in his drawer without fuss, crude in, coal in, steel out. A fourth column starts small and grows, tankers due but missing. Each week the space under that column runs longer. He does not write a conclusion beside the empty lines. He lets the lines speak. He takes delays and turns them into time. He adds days at sea for the Borneo run, notes weather holds, notes the new routes that curve to avoid danger. Then he asks a simple thing. What if arrivals slip by half? On the page he draws a clean break point. If that happens, refineries idle and the pool of high-octane fuel shrinks first. That pool feeds aircraft before it feeds trucks or dock cranes because the war orders say so. He does not claim to know more than his ledger. He writes days, arrivals, tonnage lost versus built, and leaves the cause and effect chain visible. If tankers are late, refineries run short. If refineries run short, aviation gas is rationed. If aviation gas is rationed, training and patrol hours fall and fewer escorts can sail. He thinks of it as a wheel that can speed up or slow down. In his notes, he marks where he thinks the wheel can seize. On the 3rd of January, 1942, he drafts his first secret memo to Tokyo. He keeps it plain. Prioritize escorts and convoys over new hulls or flashy weapons. Pool the tankers that still move. Guard them. He adds that rail transport should shift priority to coal and food, so mills can fire and workers can eat. Aircraft and ships do not run if furnaces are cold or men faint at their stations. He hand copies the memo in carbon and hides the copy under a blank ledger, so anyone lifting the top page will find nothing. He routes the original through a clerk he trusts, a man who once sent his pay slip to the right desk when a higher office had filed it wrong. The memo holds no slogans. It lists days at sea, arrivals, and a forecast he can defend. He dates it and watches the door through which the clerk leaves. Early 1942, reports of tankers hit on the Borneo. Japan line begin to show up where he can see them. Berths left empty, refineries asking for delay notices, a whisper in a port office that a ship overdue will not come back. His graphs bend down. He stops arguing for targets no one will meet. He revises steel output down to match likely fuel and ore, so mills do not trip over each other for trains that will not arrive. He proposes moving coking coal before anything that can wait. He suggests that repair crews get priority if outages spike, so maintenance does not cascade into stoppage. The official answer is a neat stamp that says received. The priority orders that reach factories still praise maximum output, still reward tonnage announced, not tonnage delivered. He notes the gap and adds a line to the ledger. Wasted effort due to misaligned goals, counted in idle shifts. On the 18th of May, 1942, he meets a Navy logistics officer in a quiet corner near the yard offices. The officer's cap sits on his knee. His words do not carry far. He admits convoy gaps along the southern lanes and says escorts are thin where submarines hunt. The officer does not hand over a table. He points to a missing ship list posted 3 days before and leaves a finger on 2 tankers that were due a week apart. The tone tells Takeda more than the numbers. He cannot verify beyond that list in that tone, so he writes only what he can support. He adds a single line to his next note. Convoy coverage appears inadequate on key oil routes, as reflected by missed arrivals on dates, and why he makes his own goal clear to himself. Keep the engines running long enough that someone with power can shift strategy without collapse. He underlines that line once and puts the pencil down. The risk arrives without warning. A Kempeitai inspector asks him why a civilian planner needs ship loss tables. The inspector stands too close to his desk and looks at the wrong drawer. Takeda says he balances factory duty rosters and needs to know which shifts will be cut if deliveries slip. He does not add a sentence after that. He stops and watches his own hands so they do not fidget. When the steps fade in the hall, he changes his habits. He reduces the specifics on paper. He begins to encode trends as color marks on a small desk calendar that no one reads. Red for missed tanker arrivals, blue for coal shortfalls, black for steel that will not be poured because coke is late. He can look at a month and see the break points without a number a stranger can seize. By the 29th of June, 1942, he walks the yards and sees cranes idle between jobs, not for a minute but for stretches that feel like the length of a train. In the mill, he hears hoppers scrape empty as crews push the last fines toward the furnaces. The sound has a thin edge that he has learned to hear. He matches that edge to the red marks on the calendar, and to a new line in the ledger that shows the gap between oil planned and oil in tank. The picture forms without a headline. The blockade is cutting muscle, not skin. He writes another memo that keeps to the same terms and the same ask. Pool tankers, form convoys, shift rail priority. Protect aviation fuel with a schedule everyone can follow. The answer is another stamp. The orders that reach him still talk of expansion. He does not stop counting. He trims his forecasts to what can be fed. He moves his seat closer to the file cabinet that holds berth schedules, so he can see changes before they spread across the room. He listens to port officers when they grumble about tankers that announce no arrival signal. He notes which refinery asks for a repair crew twice in 1 month. He draws the wheel in his mind again and looks at the spokes that can be strengthened. Each choice he makes is small. A table revised, a phrase softened so it can pass, a color mark added to a square that already holds 2. What changes is his sense of time. He no longer thinks in quarters. He thinks in the distance a tanker must cover, the days it must cross without an escort, the meals a worker must eat to stand at a furnace that should not cool. What survives is his ledger, and the habit of writing only what can be seen and checked. What he learns is that the shortest line on the page, the one that shows the gap in arrivals, can pull down every longer line that follows. He ties his fate to the engines not out of sentiment but because their noise, or their silence, will carry his warnings farther than his name will ever go. On the 12th of November, 1942, he writes a second memo because the first earned only a stamp. He keeps it step by step so a manager can follow it without a speech. Shorter production runs to cut changeover waste. Shared components so fewer unique parts choke the lines. Shipments in convoy, not as singles, paced by what the port roster can actually move. He limits himself to what he can see. Stoppage reports that land on his desk. Time and motion sheets a foreman lets him copy. The weekly list of ships due and ships absent. He adds a tactic born of those lists. Move high-value cargo at night when patrols thin, and send non-critical loads by day as bait, so eyes tilt away from fuel. Therefore he asks that escorts be concentrated on tankers and coal barges, because steel without fuel is dead weight and coal without barges sits on docks and cools furnaces that should burn. He drafts alternate schedules to prove the idea, not just state it. He walks his finger down a roster and pairs tankers with the few escorts still listed near home waters. He draws two columns. Night runs for aviation fuel and refinery parts. Day runs for lumber and scrap. He notes the moon phases in the margin because extra dark gives cover. He marks a practice of common parts across aircraft lines. One bolt size used in two assemblies saves minutes at bins and hours in supply. He calculates the gain in a quiet corner, numbers tight. Minutes saved per shift, coal saved per hour idle avoided, escorts redeployed per convoy formed. He leaves slogans out and sends the plan up. The reply, if it comes, does not reach his desk. He records that outcome as zero and moves on. On the 9th of March, 1943, a rail dispatcher invites him to a side bench near the window where a draft lifts the edge of paper. The man shows him coal shortfalls in black pencil that bites the page. He does not hand over the sheet. He drags a finger down the column and stops at the totals. Takeda fixes the numbers in his mind and writes them later as ranges he can defend. Because coal is light in those figures, he builds a brief for priority coal trains to the mills that keep shipyards fed. He writes a simple chain. If a furnace cools on the 14th, the heat-up on the 16th costs 2 days of fuel and 10 days of wear, and the billets due on the 20th will slip. Therefore he asks rail to hold back flour, not coal, only when the bins are safe. He adds a line that says this is a temporary sequence, not a new rule. He sends the brief with the same plain tone and stamps the copy for his drawer. Training logs cross his desk that spring, because a clerk, bored or kind, misroutes a stack. He sees reduced flight hours noted in small, neat script beside squadron numbers. Hours down means engines that will sit unused if output targets hold. He does not guess. He writes only what the logs show: fewer hours flown, more engines scheduled to arrive. Because that gap invites waste, he proposes cutting aircraft output targets to match fuel reality. He knows it will not sell if it sounds like retreat. So he hides the ask inside a procurement budget. the only channel he sees that still lands on a minister's desk. Line items swell and shrink to carry a message. Spare engines slow, repair kits steady, high-octane additives guarded. He balances figures so the totals look clean, the way a gate opens for a cart that does not rattle. The exposure is small and sudden. A superior slides the budget back with a red note in the margin that says, "Stay within scope." He signs compliance where the man points and keeps his face flat. He lets the carbon copy dry and tucks it under a ledger flap so a casual look will pass over it. Therefore he shifts to the only room he can still shape, informal briefings by a wall map. He pins absent tankers with gray heads and lets the pattern speak. He calls it a picture of work hours lost, not a case against any service. When someone asks what he wants, he says he wants factory uptime, which requires escorts on tankers and coal barges, and more repair craft at the yard so damage does not sit. He urges fewer large hulls and more escorts, but he cites only yard schedules he can see and loss lists posted near the port office, not war plans he never holds. Because Army and Navy priorities grind against each other in meetings he attends, he frames every ask as a line item in hours. An officer says a big hull lifts morale. He answers that a cooled furnace costs 2 days to reheat. Another officer wants more training machines. He answers that flight hours say fuel is short, so a smaller run of engines with full maintenance wins more sorties than larger runs that sit. He sees heads turn because numbers, not sides, are on the table. He leaves behind one-page sheets that show uptime by route. Coastal coal barges up when guarded. Oil runs flat when escorts scatter. Steel dispatches wasteful when trains carry the wrong cargo in the wrong week. He writes a contingency for nights when escorts cannot be found. Small, high-octane fuel loads move by fishing junks that stay within sight of shore and slip into coves at slack tide. He knows the risk to men with nets, so he keeps volumes small and routes short. Tradecraft shifts with that choice. He creates duplicate routing cards, one set honest, one set labeled lubricant, because that word draws less attention than aviation. The honest set he keeps in a pocket file marked with his initials. The cover set sits in a dock office where any inspector can flip it and see nothing worth a second look. He schedules runs against the moon and the patrol habits he has heard and recorded without writing names. He does not promise success. He measures what returns. Near Nagoya, a training squadron reports 2 extra weeks of flight time after a delivery he helped schedule by that inshore route. The field does not thank him. It does not know his name. He sees the effect only as a line in a log that tilts up, and he writes the dates in his desk calendar in blue. Because of that small lift, he keeps the fishing runs in the rotation and adjusts volumes like a man trimming a lamp. On the 4th of August, 1943, he updates his forecast. Without convoy concentration, the engines will slow by mid-1944 regardless of bombing. He writes it that clean. He sends the line in a short note that uses the same words he has used before. For a week, he sees 2 escorts tied to a coastal coal convoy he has flagged. Then the pins move and the map shifts back. He circles those 7 days in his calendar and moves his hand to the next square where he will draw the next small line. Formal channels stall. A Navy procurement officer takes him, on the 17th of December, 1943, to a back office that smells of stale smoke. A broker waits with a cloth folder. Take to seize only what the man lays out. Invoices that say lubricants or mixed oils, not aviation fuel. A list of depot clerks with narrow notes beside their names. A schedule that shows night delivery windows. The broker speaks in terms of receipts and handcarts, not grand plans. If the test stand goes cold, engines wait and training stops. That link is plain on the tables on his desk. Because he can see that link, he agrees to explore the offer. His choice takes a form he can file. He writes a requisition that asks for lubricants to support maintenance and trials. The quantities fit a test cell, not a squadron. He makes the paper bland and complete so it will pass without a question. He keeps a carbon that shows his name, then files it under a neutral tab. He adds a new line to his ledger because he needs to track what moves. A green mark for drums rooted under Army cover. He never explains the green mark aloud. It sits between coal and steel and lines up with nights when the test cell runs. It is outside the plan and inside his accounting. Rivalry bites the first week. An Army quartermaster denies rail space for drums because a munitions shipment claims the cars. The denial arrives as a neat stamp and a missing line on a yard roster. Because of that, he asks the Navy officer if a siding can open after dark. The answer is a small nod and 2 dates, offered only if the paperwork stays calm. He passes those dates to a rail dispatcher he already trusts, a man who will swap slots at midnight if a page arrives without a splash of ink. 2 nights later, drums stand in shadow against a fence, then slide onto a short train that moves during curfew when the yard is quiet. The ledger gets 2 green ticks. The test stand warms and holds. The risk shows itself as a hand on a cart. On the 23rd of February, 1944, a patrol stops a runner with 2 drums and asks for papers. Takeda hears about it the next morning as a single line from the broker, not as a complaint. The runner had produced the lubricants requisition he had signed. The patrol decided the paper was in order and let the cart go. The drums reached the plant. He feels the pull in his ribs because his name sat at the hinge. He writes the date in green and moves his eyes back to hours logged at the test stand. He knows why he chose this path. He also knows that paper can cut. The moral cost is simple to state on a page and heavy to hold. Every drum that feeds an engine on a stand is a drum not feeding a truck at the front. He cannot see the front. He can see a training log and an engine test sheet. So he records what he can see: hours gained, faults caught, sorties that will not fail their first climb because a bearing ran dry. He draws a line he will not cross. No siphoning from hospital generators. He tells the broker that there are depots with surplus and depots that keep wards lit. The broker nods and writes new depot names beside the vague commodity lines. A week later, a drum scheduled for a clinic's yard does not move. Another, marked for a depot with tanks full, does. Air raids start to touch the coast more often in 1944. He learns this not from bulletins but from broken windows taped with paper and a shift bell that rings at odd hours after a warning siren. Inland plants ask for help because compressors are seizing and diesels are dry. The gray stream shifts to meet that. He arranges barter in a way that leaves few words on paper. Spare parts leave a storeroom for a depot that holds fuel. A small truck brings back drums at night. The terms are simple. Parts that keep a depot's pumps alive in exchange for fuel that keeps a plant's pumps alive. A factory foreman he trusts puts a tarp over the drums and sits with them through the hours before dawn. He splits his ration with the watch so no one leaves for food. A small circle forms because results are visible, and speech can get a man in trouble. The rail dispatcher watches the yard clock and switches a slot only when the platform is clear. The foreman counts the drums twice and seals them with wire he twists by hand. The broker writes short notes and keeps the list of clerks away from tables a stranger can lean on. Takeda measures the circle by the lines in his ledger. Green marks match to blackouts that do not become stoppages. A turbine test runs to the end without a scrape of metal. The count is small but real. That is enough to keep them moving. He hears from a pilot trainee in a hallway that smells of wet wool. The man speaks about hours in the air that month with a mix of apology and relief, as if more flying would be good but fuel rules the day. Takeda does not ask for details he should not have. He fixes the hint to the dates he knows. A few extra sorties traced to the week after drums moved inland confirm both the value and the limit of the stream. Because directives still demand rising output, he writes a fourth memo on the 7th of June, 1944. He keeps it plain: scale targets to fuel or lines will stop suddenly. The reply is a stamped refusal. A colleague passes him a quiet warning not to write again if he wants to breathe clear air. He takes the warning as fact and reduces the words he sends up. He narrows his work to actions he can own: night routing, discrete swaps, paper that says little and moves enough. The ledger becomes the one place where the whole picture sits. He keeps colors instead of names and records only what hours of operation prove. When an army man tries to pull drums from a clinic yard, he steps in and says the item is frozen by maintenance needs, which is true in the terms he has written for himself. The broker adjusts, and the flow bends around the hole without breaking. The test cell hums. A compressor that would have seized does not. A training field logs a pattern of short flights that take off and land without incident. By late 1944, the thread is thin. Air raids push more work inland, but the number of drums he can move does not grow. The green line on his ledger cannot rise to meet the need of furnaces that must eat by the train load. It can feed a stand and lift a few wings off a strip. It cannot keep blast furnaces hot. He sees the truth in crane hooks that hang quiet at noon, and in steel pours that skip a day because coke is late and oil is low. He does not pretend the stream is more than it is. He holds the narrow gains he can measure and accepts that they live inside a larger decline he cannot stop. Convoys thin through 1944, and the pins on his wall map thin with them. Where he once marked arrivals in rows, gaps open like missing teeth. Tankers lost are not replaced fast enough. The berth rosters prove it. On the 19th of June, 1944, he reads a notice that a major yard's tanker order is delayed. The paper is bland. The effect is not. He takes his pencil and moves his shutdown line forward on the calendar squares he keeps for fuel. Less hulls means fewer safe trips. Fewer trips means refineries that cannot keep their pools full. He writes no words beside the new line. On the 9th of July, 1944, he hears that Saipan has fallen. He does not see the island. He sees the shipping lanes on the small chart pinned near the door, and the way front lines now lie nearer to the paths his tankers must take. Because the distance is shorter, patrols can be more frequent. Because patrols are more frequent, the risk on each leg rises. He redraws days at sea on a scrap he keeps under his blotter and adds a margin for delays that will not be explained. The clean wheel in his mind grinds a notch tighter. He expects fewer arrivals and plans for less motion. Early 1945, he hears about mines set at night by aircraft. A port clerk traces a shape in the air and says nothing else. On the 28th of March, 1945, the phrase Operation Starvation passes in a port office he visits for a roster. He does not write the phrase. He writes what he sees. Coastal coal barges slow, harbor entries wait, and a rail yard he watches reports engines idle with no loads to pull. He marks the coal shortfall in red because steel furnaces cannot eat promises. They eat coal, air, and time. In April, rolling blackouts spread. One Monday, a mill siren that should sound at 6 stays silent. He stands in a passage and feels the pause run long. Because barges stall, he tries a narrow path. On the 3rd of May, 1945, he trades 2 fuel drums for a slot on an inland canal run that could bring coal around the mined coast. He signs the paper that moves the drums as lubricant, the way he has learned to write it. He stands by a lock in the dark and counts minutes against the canal schedule in his head. The barge does not come. No signal. No wake. He returns to his desk and draws a small cross beside the date. He subtracts the 2 drums from his green marks and adds nothing to coal. The ledger feels heavier for a loss he cannot trace. The exposure comes as a flashlight beam across his coat. A security officer steps out of the night and asks for his papers. Takeda offers the pass stamped by the factory office and keeps his breath smooth. The officer asks what cargo moves. He points to the stamp and recites a shipment code from memory without raising his eyes. The code is correct. The beam drops. The officer waves him through. He walks on and knows a line has grown thin under his feet. After that, he stops carrying any list that names a depot. He keeps routes in his head and uses only the smallest marks on paper. On the 1st of June, 1945, he writes his last memo. The words are plain. Stop adding new lines. Conserve power for maintenance and transport. Otherwise, the grid will quit without warning. He ties each clause to the sheets on his desk. Stoppage reports, coal dispatch slips, train delays. He sends it by the same trusted hand. He sees only the counterorder that follows, increase output for a coming decisive phase. He does not argue in the hall. He slides his copy into a drawer and turns the key. The drawer holds colored squares and thin lines that cannot move a train. On the 12th of June, 1945, he arrives at dawn and finds a machine hall with dead gauges and unlit panels. The air smells like cold iron and oil that has not warmed. Coal trains have stalled. The drums he could move are gone. The compressors cannot start, and therefore the line waits in silence. He walks the floor with a foreman and they count belts they cannot move and engines they cannot fire. No bombs have fallen here this morning. They stand under a hoist and listen to nothing. In his head, the chain is short. No compressors means no oxygen for furnaces. No oxygen means no heat. Without heat, steel is a plan on paper. That afternoon he gathers his ledgers, the pins from the wall, and the calendars with their small red, blue, black, and green squares. He lays them in order and sees a plain story without slogans. Shipping starved fuel, fuel starved motion, motion starved steel. By late June 1945, the transport crisis is no longer a forecast. Trams crawl or stop. In his circle, that means bicycles at midnight and paper logs by candlelight because bulbs do not hold. The numbers on his sheets stop changing because the wheels under them have stopped. He does not write another memo. There is nothing left that a line of figures can change. His fate lies with silent engines, and their silence spreads beyond his yard to the empire that built them. Takeda survives the shutdown, slides his ledgers and calendars into a plain box no one asks to open, and walks past machine halls that stay cold, while a few test cells and small generators still run on scraps. In the last weeks he sees orders shift from targets to survival, guard the rails, feed the workers, lines that echo the memos he wrote and sent up without reply. After the war he reads planners who put logistics and energy first and finds his private notes match their public words. On a silent factory floor he knows what his numbers said from the start: fuel, not bombs, stop the engines. And the box he kept becomes a quiet promise to build the ships, the escorts, and the stockpiles of power so they do not fall silent again.